June 19, 1944. The Pacific Ocean, a blue infinity broken only by the flat silhouettes of American carriers. The sun hangs high and harsh above the water. Heat radiates off metal flight decks as young Navy pilots grip their throttles, sweat collecting on their brows. Beneath them, Hellcats idle, engines growling with the deep, confident rumble of American industry. Up above, glints of silver and green slice the horizon. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, once the terror of the Pacific, diving with predatory precision. For years they led every engagement. For years they toyed with slower, heavier American fighters and lived to boast about it. Japanese pilots had joked that American aircraft were clumsy iron crates. Easy targets, burning wrecks waiting to fall. But today, something is different. The F6F Hellcats are climbing to meet them. Not sluggish, not fragile, not inferior. A new predator has entered the battlefield, one designed not to match the Zero's maneuvers, but to end its reign. Engines scream. Sunlight flashes off wings, and high above the Marianas, legends collide as the masters of the sky prepare to be dethroned. The battle is only beginning. The Pacific War did not begin with air superiority in American hands. In 1941 and into early 1942, the skies belonged to the Empire of Japan. Their pilots were among the most experienced in the world, battle-hardened from years of conflict in China. Their aircraft, especially the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, seemed untouchable. Lightweight, agile, and boasting extraordinary range, the Zero could strike deep into enemy territory and return safely. In combat, it could turn inside almost anything the Allies put up against it. Its design philosophy was built on maneuverability, minimal armor, paper-thin skin, and fuel tanks lacking self-sealing, all to cut weight and boost performance. And for a time, the gamble paid off. At Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island, at Singapore, and over the vast reaches of the Dutch East Indies, Japanese fighter pilots proved their dominance. They outflew and outgunned opponents who never expected such precision from an aircraft so far from Europe's influence. American and British pilots tried to fight the Zero, the way they fought the German Bf-109 or the Italian Machi C-202, and many paid with their lives. Standard dogfight doctrine turned fatal when facing a Zero's rapid turn radius. The U.S. Navy's primary fighter then was the Grumman F4F Wildcat. It was tough, well-built, and surprisingly capable in the right hands, but underpowered and outmaneuvered. Wildcat pilots had to invent new tactics, like the thatch weave, simply to survive. Pieces of wrecked Zeros, when examined by Allied engineers, revealed an unsettling truth. Japan had leapfrogged ahead of American fighter design. For many officers in Washington and Pearl Harbor, it was a shocking wake-up call. America, with its massive industrial base and technological ambition, had been caught behind. What the U.S. Navy needed was not just a replacement. It needed a fighter that could dominate. A machine powerful enough to seize the initiative and restore confidence to pilots who had been fighting uphill from the first day. The war at sea was changing too. Battleships were no longer the decisive measure of power. Aircraft carriers now determined who controlled the ocean. If the U.S. failed to secure the skies above its fleets, no amount of steel hulls could stop Japan's advance. So the Navy turned once again to Grumman aircraft. Leroy Grumman and his team had already earned a reputation for dependable designs, aircraft that brought pilots home, even when punched full of holes. They understood what naval aviators needed, because they listened to the men who flew. Their next fighter would have to be tougher than anything in the Pacific, heavily armed, fast, and high-climbing, carrier-friendly, and able to beat the Zero on its own terms, or rewrite the terms entirely in mid-1942. As battles raged across the Solomon Islands, and the first hints of American recovery appeared at Coral Sea and Midway, the blueprints for a new generation fighter were already becoming aluminum reality. The Zero's supremacy was still largely unchallenged. Pilots laughed at the idea that a slower, bulkier American plane could threaten them. The early war had reinforced their confidence, even arrogance. Yet behind closed hangar doors on Long Island, engineers were crafting something the Japanese had not prepared for. Something heavier, something meaner, something built not to absorb the Zero's rules, but to break them. Japan had set the stage with its early victories. Now the United States was preparing its answer, and as the war intensified, Grumman's creation was almost ready to spread its wings. The moment would come soon, when Zero pilots would realize that dominance is never permanent. The next step in this story begins with a roaring engine, a new airframe, and the relentless pace of American industry. The most crucial decision in the Hellcat's creation came from the heart of the machine, its engine. Grumman chose the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial powerhouse that would become legendary across multiple fighters. It wasn't elegant, it was loud, brutal, and unforgiving. But it provided the one thing every pilot begged for: power. With that engine, the new fighter could climb faster, hit harder, and shrug off dives that would tear other aircraft apart. The design team reinforced every aspect of the plane: thick armor around the cockpit, bullet-resistant glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks. The pilot would finally have protection equal to the stakes of the Pacific War. This aircraft wasn't built to dance. It was built to survive and win. Unlike the Zero, which sacrificed everything for agility, the Hellcat embraced durability. It could take hits and bring pilots back to the deck alive. Many aviators would later recall staggering back to their carrier, wings shredded, fuel streaming, but alive, thanks to Grumman's philosophy of ironworks toughness. The wings were designed to fold smoothly for carrier storage, and the wide-set landing gear provided stability during rough carrier landings, a stark contrast to the narrow, fragile legs of many Japanese fighters. And then came the teeth. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 3 per wing. Their combined firepower could rip a Zero apart with a single solid burst. This firepower was familiar, reliable, and devastating, giving American pilots a sense of control and confidence the earlier Wildcat could never quite provide. Development moved with wartime urgency. Flight tests began in mid-1942, and the first F6F-3 models reached frontline squadrons less than a year later. It was a staggering pace, proof of American industry shifting into a higher gear. Meanwhile, Japan faced a different reality beneath their early triumphs. The Zero, designed before the war began, was built for short campaigns and rapid victories, not a multi-year industrial struggle against a global superpower. Its weaknesses became clearer every month. No room for major upgrades, fragile structure, lack of pilot armor, catastrophic fuel tank vulnerability, and most importantly, Japan could not replace pilots at the rate they were losing them. Veteran aviators, the elite corps who once dominated every encounter, were disappearing. Replacements came with fewer flight hours, less tactical training, and far less engine time. Training programs that once spanned years were reduced to months, sometimes weeks. While American pilots refined tactics like boom and zoom diving attacks, the thatch-weave defensive maneuver, coordinated combat through radio-disciplined Japanese, fighters relied heavily on individual pilot skill, a strength that began eroding as their talent pool dwindled. Technology was shifting the balance too. Radar-directed fighter control aboard American carriers meant Hellcats could be vectored onto incoming raids before the enemy even spotted them. The Pacific sky was no longer blind. The contrast grew sharper with each new battle. Japan was fighting the war it wanted, a contest of individual skill and spiritual resolve. America was fighting the war it had prepared for, a battle of factories, logistics, and science. By 1943, both the aircraft and the pilots who would fly it were ready. The Hellcat arrived in the Pacific like a steel storm, and the Navy aviators who strapped into its cockpit were determined to rewrite the story that began at Pearl Harbor. Soon, the laughing would stop. Because the next time Zero pilots met this clumsy American fighter, they would discover it was not a joke, but the beginning of the end. The encounter that would transform the Pacific Air War now moves to the human and tactical angles that shaped the fight. The clash of design philosophies, the F6F Hellcat and the A6M Zero, were born from completely different assumptions about what a fighter should be. On one side stood Japanese aviation doctrine, rooted in the teachings of interwar aces and samurai ideals. The perfect fighter, they believed, must be agile above all else. Maneuverability was the divine advantage. The Zero embodied this belief entirely. Feather-light construction, no armor, and long, graceful wings to slice the air in tight turns. For early Japanese strategists, the idea of a heavy fighter, armored, weighed down with ammo, bulky enough to survive punishment, felt crude, inelegant, almost dishonorable. Then came the Hellcat, a machine that represented the American approach. The best aircraft is the one that brings its pilot home. It was not the best turner in the sky, but it didn't need to be. It traded elegance for raw performance, speed, dive capability, firepower, and ruggedness. When a Zero pilot made a mistake, it could be fatal. When a Hellcat pilot erred, he often got a second chance. This difference, one built on survival, the other on perfection, would shape the outcomes of countless dogfights. The evolution of the American fighter pilot in 1942, many U.S. Navy pilots felt outmatched. They watched friends fall to Zero guns or float for hours in the ocean waiting for rescue. Training was thorough, but experience lagged far behind Japan's seasoned aces. But war is an unforgiving teacher. American pilots watched and learned. They studied the Zero's moves, its blistering turns, its vulnerability in a dive. Intelligence analyses revealed structural weaknesses that could be exploited. The Wildcat veterans who survived the early battles became instructors, passing on knowledge bought with blood. The Hellcat arrived as a perfect partner to that evolution. Young men trained in massive programs stateside, flight schools, gunnery ranges, carrier qualifications, feeding a growing force of naval aviators. Each pilot who launched from a carrier deck carried not just personal skill, but doctrine, coordinated combat tactics, teamwork above heroics, radios guiding their instincts. They no longer chased the Zero into its deadly turning circle. They hunted it on their own terms. The transformation was profound. The U.S. Navy pilot no longer feared the engagement. He controlled it. The air war turns. Technological by mid-war, battles were no longer just pilot versus pilot. The invisible advantage of radar-directed interceptions became decisive. High above the ocean, Hellcats were vectored into perfect attack positions, climbing from the sun, diving from altitude. Arriving with energy superiority, American carriers became floating fortresses of radio coordination. Radar operators monitored approaching raids while combat air patrol squadrons orbited with discipline. This system meant that Hellcats could intercept Japanese formations long before they reached their targets. The result? Fewer surprises, more prepared interceptions, and a deadly shift in air control. Meanwhile, Japan struggled with limited radar coverage, spotty communications, and a dwindling pool of veteran officers who once could turn chaos into opportunity. The battlefield had changed. No longer did the Zero determine where and when the fight began. Technology, the silent co-pilot of every Hellcat, tilted the Pacific sky in America's favor. By combining brute mechanical power, shifting pilot philosophy, and technological integration, the Hellcat began rewriting outcomes that once seemed inevitable. Yet there are more angles to uncover, deeper forces driving this clash toward its dramatic turning point. Tactics. Outthinking the Zero early in the war, American pilots quickly learned that dogfighting a Zero by turning was suicide. Its light frame and enormous wings made for unmatched agility, but that strength came with a fatal flaw. The Zero could not handle high-speed dives or abrupt high-G maneuvers. Its wings would flutter, controls would seize. A single mistake could rip it apart. So U.S. aviators changed the rules. Hellcat pilots used boom and zoom tactics, dive from above, fire a quick lethal burst and climb back to altitude before the Zero could respond. The Hellcat's strong airframe and powerful engine allowed it to dictate the pace vertically rather than horizontally. Formations became smarter too. The thatch weave, once a desperate measure used by Wildcat pilots, flourished with the Hellcat's performance. Two fighters flying in a crisscrossing pattern could bait a Zero into a fatal angle, turning defense into offense. Japan's once feared turning duels were no longer the script of victory. Hellcats refused to play their game and started winning theirs. Industrial might versus exhaustion. A fighter does not win a war alone. It requires fuel, factories, metals, transport ships, replacement parts, mechanics, and a limitless chain of logistics tugging across oceans. In this arena, Japan was overwhelmed. American shipyards produced new carriers, new aircraft, and endless spare parts, a supply line stretching from California to remote island strips. Pilots crashed and survived. Aircraft could be replaced. If a squadron lost planes, more would arrive next week. Japan operated under severe scarcity. Aluminum was precious. Engines were pushed beyond their limits. Replacement airframes trickled out in numbers too small to offset losses. Most critically, pilot replacements lacked the training to handle. Japan's once elite aircraft, the Zero, had been designed for a quick war, the one Japan hoped to fight. The Hellcat helped deliver a long war, the one Japan could not sustain. The human heart of the conflict behind every machine was a man, a heartbeat suspended between the ocean below and death above. Japanese aviators carried the weight of national pride, drilled into a culture where survival was secondary to honor. Many believed they would never return home, and they flew with ferocious intent. American pilots understood fear just as sharply, but their cause demanded something different. Not sacrifice, but success. Not death, but return. When a Hellcat pilot survived a mission, he often walked into dinner on the carrier deck that night. He wrote letters home. He lived to fight again the next day. That consistency, that continuity of experience, turned scared rookies into aces within months. Meanwhile, Japanese replacements faced a harsh reality. Fewer mentors, fewer missions survived, fewer chances to learn and grow. A shrinking circle of veterans shouldered a burden too heavy to sustain. War is not just steel. It is resolve, fatigue, and the slow erosion of hope. By late 1943, even the most confident Zero pilots could sense the shift. The skies no longer welcomed them. They stalked into battles uncertain if they would return, while Hellcat pilots rose feeling that victory was within reach. These angles, tactical intelligence, industrial endurance, and human resilience, all converged in the cockpit of the F6F Hellcat. And soon they would collide violently with the fighters that once dominated the Pacific. Now, the story accelerates to the pivotal engagements where reputations are shattered and new legends are born. When the Hellcat first roared into the Pacific in mid-1943, its arrival didn't come with grand fanfare. There were no headlines proclaiming the end of Japanese air supremacy. But quietly, steadily, the balance in the sky began to shift. The Solomon Islands became the proving ground. American carriers advanced, pushing the front line north from Guadalcanal. Squadrons flying the new F6F Hellcat entered combat, and Japanese pilots, expecting another Wildcat, charged with confidence. But the first encounters were unsettling for the Zero. Hellcats dove like hawks from above cloud layers, unleashing torrents of .50 caliber fire. They didn't hesitate to climb into brutal vertical maneuvers that would have ripped a Zero apart. When chased, they broke into high G turns that drained the Zero of airspeed and stability, and when hit, the Hellcat kept flying. Zeros that once shredded American fighters with a burst now found their bullets sinking into armor plating or deflecting off reinforced canopies. In return, a single solid strike from a Hellcat's guns turned the Japanese aircraft into a trail of fire and metal splinters. Reports flowed back to Japanese base commanders. This new American fighter is different. Too fast in a dive. Too strong to kill quickly. Pilots who once laughed at U.S. aircraft sensed the humor slipping away. The Marshals and Truk. Confidence grows in early 1944. U.S. forces struck Majuro, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok, a march straight into the heart of Japan's island defenses. Hellcat spearheaded the attack waves, sweeping the skies clean before bombers arrived. Pilots with only weeks of combat time scored multiple victories in a single mission. The ace count rose as replacements rapidly became lethal veterans. Latumare J. Alex Vrachu, 6 kills in 8 minutes, David. McCampbell. Dozens more to come. Squadrons seeing kill ratios that defied belief confidence, shifted from relief at surviving to expectation of success. Then came the Gibraltar of the Pacific, Truk Lagoon. Once a fortress bristling with Japanese aircraft, it was torn apart by Hellcats escorting carrier bombers. Nearly 250 Japanese planes were destroyed on the ground and in the air within days. Many never took off again. Japanese observers realized this was not a temporary setback. Their pilots were being depleted faster than they could be replaced. Their once dominant machines were falling in droves. A sky filling with blue American carriers, Essex-class giants, stretched across the ocean. Each carried dozens of Hellcats. Where there had once been a few U.S. fighters defending ships in desperation, now there were waves of them. The Pacific sky, once painted by the graceful arcs of Zero formations, was being dyed a new shade. The dark blue of the Hellcat's skin, glinting in sunlight. The Japanese Navy searched desperately for answers. Updated Zero models appeared. New tactics were attempted. Younger pilots, eager but untested, were thrown into the storm. Yet with every mission lost, with every ace killed without replacement, Japan's hopes fell further from reach. The Hellcat flew not just with horsepower, it flew with momentum, industry, and inevitability. By mid-1944, Zero pilots who had once mocked American planes now faced a haunting truth. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, and this reality would crash down in the most decisive battle of carrier warfare ever fought. A clash so one-sided that it earned a dark and unforgettable name. The skies over the Marianas were about to become a graveyard. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea. The U.S. launched the Marianas campaign, targeting Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, islands vital to Japan's defense perimeter. If America captured them, B-29 bombers could strike the Japanese homeland directly. Japan could not allow that. So the Imperial Navy assembled what remained of its carrier air power. 9 carriers, hundreds of planes and pilots who understood the stakes. They surged into the Philippine Sea, ready to challenge the American fleet in a decisive showdown. But the battlefield had changed, and Japan was already behind. Radar detects the storm before Japanese scouts could even locate the American carriers. U.S. radar operators spotted incoming groups of aircraft forming over the distant horizon, Hellcats launched by the dozens. On carrier decks, engines thundered. Pilots sprinted to their cockpits. The calm, drilled voice of flight controllers directed squadrons upward. Bandits bearing 320, Angels 15, intercept. Groups of Zeros and bomber escorts pushed forward into what they expected would be equal combat. Instead, they met a wall, Hellcats strike from above. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, nearly 70 strong, approached confidently. Many were flown by replacements with minimal combat hours, thrust into the fight without the skills their predecessors once mastered. Hellcats dove from altitude like falling stars. Tracer fire lit the sky. Bombers burst into flame. Zeros spiraled down trailing smoke. One U.S. pilot, Lieutenant Alex Vrashiu, scored 6 kills in one sortie, all enemy bombers, without taking a single bullet to his aircraft. Wave after wave came, and each was torn apart. The second Japanese attack group met the same fate. Their formations shattered long before they reached bomb release range. Veteran Japanese leaders watched helplessly from afar as their younger comrades were cut down. The sky turns against. Japan, what few Japanese planes broke through the interceptors, found another nightmare waiting. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers below. Shells exploded in dense, deadly clouds, further thinning the attacking force. By the end of the day, the results were staggering. The U.S. lost about 30 aircraft. Japan lost over 350. The incredible imbalance gave birth to the dark, almost mocking name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Because the slaughter was that one-sided, the collapse of a legend Zero pilots who once flew with swagger now returned in shock, if they returned at all. Their confidence, built on years of superiority, collapsed under the weight of a brutal new reality. The Hellcat had rendered the Zero obsolete U.S. carrier decks. Far from celebrating recklessly, approached the victory with a quiet understanding. The war wasn't over. But a critical chapter was. For Japan, it was worse than a defeat. It was the destruction of an air arm that could never be rebuilt. The Empire had entered the battle hoping to stop the American advance. Instead, it ensured the opposite. Carrier dominance now belonged indisputably to the United States. The Zero, Once the King of the Pacific was dethroned, and pilots who once laughed at the heavy American fighter now faced it as a symbol of unstoppable fate. The Pacific War would continue, but from the skies above the Marianas, everyone could see how it would end. The aftermath of this turning point would ripple through strategy, tactics, and the human cost of the conflict. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot left the Imperial Japanese Navy reeling. In a single day, they lost not only aircraft, but something far more irreplaceable: their pilots. Many of the men who fell into the Pacific had been the final thread connecting Japan's early war experience to its present struggle. Their loss created a vacuum that no crash training program could refill. Young aviators, rushed through instruction with minimal flight hours, now shouldered a burden too heavy to bear. The U.S. Navy, on the other hand, returned from the battle stronger. Pilots celebrated their victories on deck, relieved but sober, knowing the fight would continue. They gathered in ready rooms, receiving debriefs, refining tactics, and preparing to launch again the next morning. Air groups rotated. Equipment was replenished, and new Hellcats arrived in larger numbers than before. American logistics didn't just sustain the war, it accelerated it. The kill ratio told the story plainly. Hellcats achieved an extraordinary 19:1 kill ratio over the course of the Pacific War. Every encounter widened the gulf. Between the two sides' capabilities, victory opened the door to the next stage of the campaign. The Marianas fell one by one, and soon the skies above Saipan and Guam roared with U.S. air power, naval, and marine aviators flying. Hellcats cleared the path for ground forces to seize hardened fortifications. From the new airfields carved into the islands, the long-range B-29 superfortress began operations, a signal that Japan would soon face strategic bombing directly over its homeland. For Japanese strategists, the truth set in like cold steel. Carrier warfare, once their greatest strength, was slipping from their grasp entirely. In the aftermath of the Marianas' defeat, a painful transformation gripped Japanese military doctrine. With experienced pilots nearly gone and their aircraft struggling against superior opposition, a haunting question emerged. How do you fight a war you can no longer win in the air? That question led to increasingly desperate answers. Answers that would shape the final year of the conflict and force the Zero into roles its designers never dreamed of. The Hellcat's dominance had not only shifted power in the sky, but forced Japan to rethink the very nature of sacrifice and strategy. And that change brought new tactics, darker and more tragic than the war had ever seen before. After the Marianas, Japan's air strategy crossed a threshold it had never intended to approach. With fighter forces shattered and industrial capacity waning, commanders turned toward a tactic born from desperation rather than doctrine: the kamikaze. Young pilots, barely trained, were sent in aircraft stripped for speed and explosives. Japan no longer hoped to win the sky, only to make the price of victory unbearably high. The Zero, once a champion of agility and grace, became a guided weapon driven by the last remnants of the Empire's air service. Hellcat pilots watched in disbelief as adversaries deliberately chose death. Their sleek, battle-proven machines now faced enemies who no longer fought for control of the air, but for symbolic impact. It was a chilling transformation of the air war, from competitive combat to sacrificial attack. Yet even these desperate measures could not halt the overwhelming tide of American production. New carriers swarmed into the Pacific. More Hellcats filled their decks. Replacement pilots now had months of thorough training, and every lesson was sharpened by the experience of their predecessors. The war began closing in on Japan from every direction. Carrier fleets moved closer. Island airfields launched B-29 raids over Tokyo itself. The once distant roar of American engines became a daily presence in Japanese skies. Through it all, the F6F Hellcat remained the steadfast guardian of the fleet, escorting bombers, intercepting raiders, striking ships and ground targets with growing precision. Its presence symbolized a shift in American strategy from survival to inevitable victory. By war's end, Hellcats had claimed over 5,000 aerial victories, more enemy aircraft than any other U.S. Navy fighter in history. Their pilots returned home as one of the most successful communities of airmen ever assembled. Meanwhile, the Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, faded into memory as a relic of an earlier phase of the conflict. What began as a story of dominance and confidence became one of attrition, exhaustion, and tragic final gambles. The Hellcat's triumph did not come from mythical superiority or miraculous design. It was built on lessons learned through hardship engineering driven by necessity and a nation's determination to turn the tide. This transformation marked more than a tactical victory. It represented a shift in ideology, the recognition that survival, adaptability, and industrial strength would define the future of warfare. The final reflection now brings this journey to its thematic conclusion. What it meant for history, technology, and the men who fought in the vast Pacific sky. In just a few years, the Pacific sky witnessed a full reversal of power. The Mitsubishi Zero, a symbol of early war dominance, had risen from Japan's confident engineering, a promise that agility and precision would always command victory. Pilots trusted that belief with every dive, every turn, every clash above the ocean. But war is the harshest laboratory for ideas. It rewards what endures, not what dazzles. The Hellcat's victory was not glamorous. It was not the sleekest or the most graceful aircraft. It was a tool designed to withstand the brutal arithmetic of a global conflict. In the cockpit, a pilot's survival was a priority, not an afterthought. With each mission, that principle reshaped the future of aerial warfare. Durability over delicacy, firepower over flourish, teamwork over lone heroics. As the war dragged on, the Zero's legend met the limits of its purpose. What began as superiority became fragility, a reminder that technology must evolve or be swept aside. Meanwhile, the Hellcat grew stronger, its pilots more skilled, its presence more certain with every launch from a rolling carrier deck. By the end, the laughter that once greeted this heavy American crate had vanished into the waves of a sea that no longer belonged to the Empire of Japan. The skies were claimed by the deep blue wings of a machine forged from necessity and perfected by combat. The Hellcat did more than defeat an opponent. It transformed how nations approached the design and doctrine of air combat. It proved that innovation must stand with sustainability, and that an aircraft is only as strong as the system supporting it. Today, the Zero and the Hellcat sit in museums, silent, still and equal in their role as artifacts of history. But their story remains a testament to a truth written in burning fuel across the Pacific sky. Victory belongs not to the aircraft that begins the war strongest, but to the one that adapts, survives, and finishes it.